Just a few days after my grandmother Eleanor's death, everything changed in an instant. In that moment, I was facing a void and eternity. While my family awaited the distribution of her estate, I realized there was another truth lurking beneath it all. My father had seen me as his real daughter for decades. But that day, everything turned upside down. I was alone in grandmother's study, surrounded by heavy oak shelves. Behind the leather-bound books, among objects that stood like silent witnesses to those who once knew her. My eyes drifted to her portrait on one side, while on the other I could still hear my father's cold, brittle words ringing in my ears. "You're not even her real granddaughter," he'd said. His face had contorted with anger, as if it were the release of a pent-up rage he'd harbored for years. Only those with blood ties deserve the family fortune. In that moment, I felt an emptiness in my body. The importance of the family fortune had always been drilled into me. But suddenly, with such ease, the sense of belonging I'd felt for years had been hollowed out. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Don't play innocent, Mary," he snapped, his words sharp as lightning. "Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore. When Lawyer Blackwell confirmed there's no blood tie, you'll get nothing." In that instant, something inside me broke. Just 3 days after grandmother Eleanor's death, these words and truths spoken behind a woman's back floated in the air like a ghost. "Only those with blood ties deserve grandmother's estate," he said. Yet for years, I'd thought I was part of the Blackwell family. Accepting this felt like falling into a void. I paused, gazing at the portrait. Grandmother Eleanor's cold stare reminded me of the advice she'd once given me. For her, everything came down to the truth of blood ties. But what was my truth? "Eleanor was obsessed with bloodlines," my father said, pacing across the oriental rug. "But that's not real. The only reality is blood ties. The Blackwell fortune will go to the real Blackwells." There was a certainty in my father's eyes. It was as if he'd never looked at me so harshly before. In that moment, I realized something I'd never understood. That hardness in his gaze wasn't just for the family, it was for me too. He'd never truly wanted to see me. "I'll make sure of it," he said, lifting his chin. "Imposters who don't deserve that fortune like you." His words shattered my heart. I focused on him with patient determination, refusing to look away even for a second. But inside me, a storm was raging. "Only those with blood ties deserve grandmother's estate," he said again, with that commanding tone I'd seen countless times in my childhood. Looking into his eyes, I thought once more. I began to question my own identity. What it meant to be a Blackwell, how much I'd misunderstood it all these years, whether I even had a place in this family. His eyes looked at me like I was nothing more than a stranger. An hour later, even though my father promised me nothing regarding the inheritance, I felt something else in that moment. There was another strength within me. His harsh looks, his words, they no longer held any meaning. 'Cause in the end, I would stand tall with a different strength, a different identity. And that day, that night, I made a decision to move forward in that direction. I would attend the reading of grandmother Eleanor's will to prove that her intention was fair treatment. What my father or anyone else thought didn't matter. I had to do this. For myself. I had to let go of what it meant to be born a Blackwell, everything I'd thought and felt for years. And one thing was clear. Who was I, really? The next day, in the early morning hours, I found myself alone in grandmother Eleanor's study once again. As I stepped into the room, the heavy scent of wood and the deep, warm air of old books filled the space. My eyes drifted to her portrait again. That painting always seemed to pass a silent judgment whenever I felt the emptiness inside me and lost myself. In that moment, she didn't just seem like a family elder. She felt like a judge waiting for me to understand who I was. There were only a few days left until the reading of grandmother's will. After my last conversation with my father, the darkness inside me had grown even deeper. Every word he'd spoken reminded me that he'd never given me the value I deserved all these years. Everything, he said, came down to blood ties. But what about me? Who would I be if I'd never truly been accepted as part of this family all along? Hours later, I received a message from my father. Come to the will reading, but don't expect anything. I left it unanswered, but the thoughts swirling in my mind only intensified. Don't expect anything? His ruthless attitude toward me felt like it had forbidden me from asking who I was all these years. How long had I been living inside a lie? As I left the room, I wondered if my mother would come to the house. She'd sent me a message. We need to talk with your father. Alone. Reading it, a wave of unease spread through my heart. Learning the truth about who we really were meant facing a reality I didn't want. But I could no longer stop my questions. I'd always expected my father and mother to be proud of me, for my goals, my achievements. But there was always something missing. A void, something incomplete. And that missing piece was my true identity. As I stepped out of the room to attend the morning meeting, I made a decision. This wasn't just about an inheritance dispute. It was also my last chance to understand who I was. If grandmother thought I deserved this family, this fortune, then somehow I had to earn it. But this wasn't just her decision. It would be mine. That day, my father's face felt like a stranger's for the first time. His harsh gaze struck me once again with the anger he'd felt toward me for years, the worthlessness he'd made me feel. As always, I'd been wrapped in a lie. But this time, I had to watch the collapse of my relationship with him. On the day of grandmother's will reading, my father and I would face each other again. But this time, it would be with a truth I had to confront. "What are you doing, Mary?" he said coldly. His eyes seemed to wish someone else were standing in my place. "Don't do this. If you do, it'll all be over. Someone like you taking this family's most valuable fortune is unacceptable." In that moment, I felt everything was finished. I'd reached the end of everything with my father. For years, I'd wondered how I could respond to him. But then I realized something. I no longer felt anything toward him. His influence over me, the imaginary lifestyle he dictated for years, forcing me to live a life that wasn't mine, I wasn't accepting it anymore. A few days later, I entered the room where grandmother's will would be read. The room where the entire Blackwell family would gather. In that moment, I thought about the whole family. Was it love in their eyes? Greed? Family ties? Or the truth? I knew the truth would prevail in the end, but I wasn't sure how much I could endure. Looking at grandmother's portrait once more, it reminded me of who I was. In that moment, I had a chance to truly discover who I was. Neither my father's thoughts, nor anyone else's, nor their fears could stop me. I would continue this journey alone. That day, with the first light of morning, I felt the heavy atmosphere of grandmother Eleanor's mansion once again. Our family had begun to gather, and every corner, every piece of old furniture in the rooms, stood like a tomb hiding secrets unspoken for years. As I stepped into the room where grandmother's will would be read, a kind of indecision stirred within me. Before entering, my eyes drifted to the other family members opening the door. My father, as always, sat proudly in one of the salon's armchairs. His harsh gaze caught mine. He didn't need to say a word. The expression on his face showed he'd always find a reason to question who I was. There was an unease inside me. I could feel not just grandmother's eyes, but the entire family's resting on me. When everyone looked at each other, no one truly saw one another. No one noticed how alone we all were. All this wealth and inheritance overshadowed each of our deepest emotions. But in that moment, I decided to look beyond it all. For myself. To learn the truth of everything. As I stepped through the door, I noticed how cold my father's gaze was. Those eyes, which I'd once seen as my most precious treasure, now felt foreign to me. For years, I'd fought for his approval, and now here he stood, looking at me as if I were a complete stranger. "I'd never thought about this before," he muttered, as if sharing his inner thoughts while patiently observing me amid the tension. "Do you really want to find out what's written in Grandmother's will?" he said, adding, "This will be a new beginning for all of us, but only for those who question their identity." And in that moment, with his words, the tension inside me grew a little more. Yes, I had questioned my identity, but it wasn't my choice. It had become a game that shifted my place in life, forcing me to confront who I really was. Grandmother's lawyer, Harrison Mills, began reading her will after silently observing the entire family in the room. Each word felt like it was etched into a gravestone. Lawyer Blackwell looked at each family member in turn and said, "In Grandmother's will, no one is granted rights independent of blood ties. However, one person is in a position where they cannot accept this right." In that instant, my heart felt like it might leap out of my chest. My father's face began to shed its usual cold expression. There was fear in his eyes. That moment, I realized some truths needed to come to light. "That person," the lawyer paused for a moment, "is Jennifer Blackwell." A deep silence spread through the room. My father's eyes suddenly darted to me. The anger in them held all the frustration he'd bottled up for years. In that fleeting second, I realized everything had become utterly clear to me. My father hadn't told me the truth all these years. He'd shaped this life that was mine with lies. I understood that the family he'd built with me was one he'd never truly loved, one he'd never claimed as his own. Grandmother's will made me realize who I truly was. The moment I heard I wasn't my father's daughter, everything in my family crumbled. Everything he'd said about me was nothing but a lie. Who was I? Was I really part of this family? My father stood silently and approached me, his head bowed. The expression on his face carried the weight of all those years. "Mary," he said, his voice trembling. "I knew this, but you didn't have to bear it. I didn't want you to try so hard to reconcile with me. But this doesn't change who you are. I want you to accept that." In that moment, hearing those cold words, I questioned who I was once again. Mary Blackwell? Jennifer Blackwell? Everything, all these years and dreams, showed me they'd been nothing but a lie. After the will was read, Grandmother's decision left me even more shattered. Who I was became something only I could know. Yet this decision was an opportunity to start a future that belonged solely to me. After the will was read, there was no longer a void inside me. Everything was clearer now. My father's harsh gaze, following Grandmother Eleanor's death, had forced me to question everything that had fallen upon me. Identity and belonging were the complete opposite of what I'd wanted to believe for years. There had been a bond spanning decades, and when it began to break, everything unraveled quickly. But in that moment, knowing who I truly was had to be my decision alone. When Lawyer Blackwell was ready to distribute the estate, our family gathered once again. They were all in the same room, steeped in the same tense unease. My father avoided my gaze, looking coldly in another direction. The sense of worthlessness I'd felt for years had never truly left me. But now it no longer held meaning for me. In that moment, the strength inside me merged with a kind of resolve. Accepting my true identity had to be my own choice. Grandmother's estate had always been one of the family's most valuable assets. That's why everyone's eyes were on me, the granddaughter who'd worked so hard to deserve it. But in that moment, I realized that my claim to this inheritance marked the end of a false sense of belonging tied to this family's past. As Lawyer Blackwell read the documents, a silence hung in the room. Everyone waited with curiosity to see what I would do. My father's gaze that day was as cold and harsh as ever. but I fixed my eyes on him, waiting for that moment. I now knew exactly what I wanted. "Jennifer Blackwell," the lawyer said, quietly placing the papers on the table. "According to Grandmother Eleanor's will, the entire fortune will belong only to those with blood ties." In that instant, a wave of excitement rippled through the room, but my father couldn't even take a step. Those cold eyes gave way to deep fear. It was as if a sudden awareness of how little he truly knew me had struck him. But there was something more. I wasn't going to accept this. "That's not right," I said, each word resolute and clear. "If Grandmother left this fortune only to those with blood ties, then what does that mean for me? This wealth hasn't been used to unite the family. It's been used to tear us apart. I don't deserve this." As the entire family looked at me in shock, my father studied my eyes for a moment longer. "You can't accept this," he said, his tone commanding as always. "This inheritance is what the family deserves. What are you even doing here?" In that moment, I truly understood who I was. All these years, I'd forced myself to seek approval. What I'd called my family wasn't a real family. True bonds weren't built on blood alone. They had to be forged with trust and genuine values. "No," I said, my voice now patient and firm. "I don't accept it. The only thing that matters to me is finding what's true and right. And if that means finding my place in this family, then I refuse to take this inheritance." There was weariness in my eyes, but I also felt a sense of freedom within. All those years of being measured solely by success, I'd begun to understand who this family really was to me. Everything had to be built on true love and loyalty. It wasn't blood ties that mattered, but heart ties. My father examined my eyes once more. "So what will you do, Mary? If you're rejecting this inheritance, what will you do? Where will you go for the rest of your life?" My answer was clear. I'll live my life by the rules I set. To learn who I truly am, I'll walk this path alone. The entire family fell silent, but the peace inside me surpassed everything. I would remember this moment as the one when I made the greatest decision of my life. I didn't truly deserve this. It was an inheritance that didn't belong to me. After rejecting Grandmother's will, all that remained was silence. As I left the room, I left behind my father's anger and disappointment. But somehow I felt so light that the burden in my heart began to unravel slowly. Something had changed in my life in no time at all. I was embarking on a journey. I took my first step. Discovering who I truly was wasn't just about rejecting the fortune, it was about deciding what I would do with the rest of my life. How would they define me? I'd always asked myself that question, but now, instead of waiting for someone else to answer it, I decided to answer it myself. The streets of Philadelphia felt less familiar with every step. Once, everything here had seemed safe and known to me. But now, every corner, every street held the promise of a new life beginning. I could feel it. I'd carried the burden of being a first-class educated, wealthy Blackwell granddaughter, but now I felt that burden being lifted from me. It was time to exist as Mary. My goal was clear, to make a fresh start. But there was a fear inside me. That fear was the shadow of the years my father had made me feel, the shadow of his cold gaze. Seeing the beginning of everything wasn't easy. The fracture in my relationship with my father had shaken my identity to its core. Yet, at the same time, it reminded me of my own worth. After all this time, I'd finally found the courage I needed to discover my true identity. That night, I went out to meet my mother. "How will they define me?" I asked her, searching her eyes for the answer I longed for. But, as always, she chose to look at me without engaging in an argument. "Mary," she said, and in that moment there was a softness in her voice. "How will you mend things with your father? What happens now?" "Whatever happens," I said, taking a deep breath. "What matters more to me is finding myself. There was a void in me as I searched for myself, but I was also filled with hope. For years, I'd lived under the weight of my family's desires and expectations. But now it was time to carve my own path. The next day, I found myself alone in grandmother's mansion. Everything was still grand and old. There were only the old books and enduring objects. Now, this house felt like it carried the traces of a past that didn't belong to me. I'd spent so long searching for what I called family here, and now I realized something. When had my family ever truly accepted me? That day, as I walked through the mansion, I questioned my true identity and where I stood in this world. An old desk, where grandmother kept her writings, took me back to another time. An identity, a family, a past, but in the end, all that remained was me. What did I need to define myself? As a child, I'd always scrambled for my father's approval. I tried to prove I was valuable as a Blackwell. But in the end, I realized something else was necessary to define who I truly was. I was moving forward on the path to finding my own identity. And that belonged to me. Despite my father's cold gaze and years of struggle, being a true Blackwell didn't mean earning his frigid permission. It meant finding the strength within myself. With these new thoughts that carried me through the evening, I began the day anew. A day later, I was preparing to take a step toward making my own decisions. With grandmother's inheritance behind me, I had everything I needed to discover my true identity. To do that, I first had to fully accept myself. In that moment, I found the strength to move forward on my own path. And so, this journey was the final step I would take to find my true freedom. There was a kind of peace within me. Perhaps for the first time, I felt like I could rebuild everything. For years, I'd lived bowing to my father's harsh gaze, but from that day forward, I decided to find my true identity. I finally had a chance to be myself. Yet, the price of that opportunity was a journey as challenging as the comfort freedom offered. In the mornings, I walked through one of Philadelphia's old neighborhoods, seeking renewal with every step. As I crossed each street, this city, standing like a silhouette behind my old memories, reminded me of who I was. But at the same time, every corner, every glance through the windows of old buildings, brought the dark voices that threatened my certainty about the path I was on. My family, my father, their expectations. No matter how hard it was to break free from all of it, I had to find my way somehow. Today, I was alone at home. After my last conversation with my father, everything in the house started feeling foreign. All that luxury and prestige, it was nothing but a mask now. On one hand, there was a family judging me, questioning who I was, chasing after the inheritance. But on my path, there was no such simple reward. I felt the need to build a life of my own. As a child, I'd always remembered grandmother's advice. She'd constantly told me how important a granddaughter I was. But now, everything was different. Being a true Blackwell wasn't about meeting others' expectations. A true Blackwell had to be someone who accepted their real identity. A few days later, I ran into an old friend. Talking with her, it felt strange that someone I'd known for years could seem so unfamiliar. She, too, questioned my family-related expectations in the way I'd grown accustomed to. "Mary, don't you think you're doing the wrong thing?" she said, a hint of mockery in her tone. "If you accept this, it'll be the end of everything. You're rejecting the inheritance, but you're the only one who deserves that fortune. Your name is Blackwell. Is it easy to forget your family?" Without looking away, I took a deep breath. There was an uncertain unease inside me, but I was just as strong. "Yes," I said. "Deciding it's the end of everything is in my hands. But as I embark on this journey, I want to find out who I truly am. I don't owe my real identity to anyone." In that moment, the disappointment and anger in her eyes reflected briefly on my face. But the thoughts running through my mind and the decision I'd made stood above it all. Living to please those people had never brought me peace. But being myself could give me something. True freedom begins with believing in yourself. The next morning, with the resolve from the day before, I walked through the city alone. My determination to find my own path grew with every step from that day onward. Today, I was freer than I'd ever been in my life, because I'd started to accept my true identity. Sitting in a cafe, I carefully observed the people around me. Each one carried the burden of life in their own little world. The gazes watching me no longer bothered me. When a woman reading a book looked up and gave me a brief glance, I smiled. That smile was something that belonged to me. When I found my identity, I felt I'd found my true self. The day before, during my final conversation with my father, I'd felt his harsh gaze and emotional distance. But now I realized how fleeting those looks were. Understanding that I could choose my own path without depending on anyone gave me courage. That evening, I returned to grandmother's house. With every step, the objects in the house spoke to me. In a true sense, this was my home now. I existed here, knowing who I was, no longer part of something that didn't belong to me. And that night, I made a decision. I would continue finding my own way by living in this house, this mansion, honoring grandmother's memory. That morning, Philadelphia's melancholic dawn light briefly dazzled my eyes. No matter how many steps I had to take for a new life, the weight in my heart wouldn't fade. Breaking ties with my family and spending years trying to please them had prevented me from building my own identity. But now everything had changed. Yet with that change, the shadow of the past refused to let me go. Grandmother's inheritance was a significant asset in the family's eyes, but for me, its meaning was entirely different. I was still struggling to discover what I truly possessed, to fill the emptiness inside me. Proving I deserved it had been a war that spanned years. But that war was over now. Letting go of the past's burden was just a matter of decision. This journey wouldn't be easy. As I spent the night in grandmother Eleanor's house, all the memories within those old stone walls came together. I realized how estranged everything had become. This place had felt like it belonged to me for years, but it was really just a shadow. I'd believed for so long that I was part of every object, every moment in this house, and now, finding my true identity among all these things had grown difficult. My phone buzzed. It was my mother calling. I slowly opened the screen. "I don't want you to do this," she'd written. My mother had spent years trying to guide me down the right path, but she too had been pulled into a kind of uncertainty. While the whole family gathered, I'd taken these steps to find my true identity. But perhaps my mother feared she wouldn't be able to accept the real me. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. What should I do? Should I choose only my own path? I turned off the phone and set my mother's message aside. It was time to truly discover who I was. I had to stop caring about what others thought. My family might want to take something that belonged to me one last time. But I'd chosen to move forward step by step on my journey to find myself. Later that day, I sat alone in a cafe. I'd left my past and everything the family had imposed on me behind. On that rainy day, the sounds from the other tables couldn't fill the emptiness inside me. On one side, there was the heavy burden of the past. On the other, the loneliness of this journey to find my true identity. "Mary!" I heard a voice. That familiar tone felt like one I'd only dreamed of for years. I lifted my head and my eyes settled on the person in front of me. Uncle James. The old days I'd spent with him came rushing back. I didn't know anyone in explanation. "I need to talk to you," Uncle James said, a sadness in his eyes. "I've thought about grandmother's fortune. I know how the family has treated you. But I want to see how strong you are. I've always wanted to see it." Uncle James had been a man who'd approached me with love for years. Though his relationship with my father was strained, he'd always made me feel valued. And now I realized how different everything was on this path to finding my true identity. "Thank you," I said, my voice tinged with vulnerability. "But I've decided to choose my own path now. This fortune isn't that important anymore." Uncle James looked deeply into my eyes and smiled. "Maybe that's your real strength. Finding it will show who you truly are. You need to trust yourself, not others." In that moment, I felt my true strength more clearly. Seeing how much the past had affected me, realizing how much unease I'd carried, I'd finally gained the courage I needed to find myself. Everything would now take shape through my choices. That night, as I returned to the old house, everything became even clearer. Grandmother Eleanor's inheritance and the responsibilities my family had placed on me didn't belong to me. Instead of letting them define who I was, I had to take steps to find myself. Who I truly was. I had to achieve that. That morning, Philadelphia's gray dawn light marked both a complete change and a beginning filled with renewal for me. All this time, I tried to define myself through others' eyes. My father's expectations, the family's past, the responsibilities the inheritance thrust upon me. They hadn't defined who I was, they'd only imprisoned me. But that morning, there was a profound inner peace. I'd finally found my true identity, and now it was the perfect time to choose my own path and build my own life. Rejecting grandmother's inheritance had given me only one thing: freedom. But freedom wasn't just physical. It required an emotional and mental step forward. To truly understand who I was, I had to leave everything from my past behind. My father's harsh gaze still lingered in my memory, but it no longer affected me. I'd come to understand what it meant to exist as Mary. Accepting my true identity without needing my family's approval meant rejecting the life others had handed me. Now, the journey of a woman whose self had been denied for years to find her true identity had begun. That day, I took my first step into an entirely new life. I started by taking each step to make a fresh beginning, fulfill my purpose, and most importantly, walk my own path. Sometime later, I ran into an old friend. There was astonishment in her eyes. She'd known me for years, but perhaps had never truly understood me. "Mary, are you really living for yourself? Do you know what it means to reject your family's fortune? You're risking your own future." In that moment, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I no longer had to explain anything to anyone. Knowing who I truly was, I refused to live just to meet others' expectations. "Yes," I said, smiling. "Taking a risk means discovering real life. To find out who I truly am and choose the right path in the end, I have to take that risk. I'll build my future based on my own choices, not others' opinions." In that instant, the astonishment in my old friend's eyes faded. Perhaps true freedom was not caring what others thought and listening only to the voice within. Her gaze confirmed that I'd stepped into real freedom. Walking through Philadelphia's streets, I felt I no longer needed to put myself in someone else's shoes. Once I'd found my own path, I could face any challenge that came my way. A new beginning wasn't just about finding a job, starting a family, or moving to another city. True freedom was accepting my own identity. One morning, as I looked at the walls of grandmother's mansion, I made peace with my past. Slowly, gazing among the old furniture and the books bearing the weight of years, I decided to let go of everything that didn't belong to me. This house had once given me a sense of belonging, but when I found my true freedom, nothing in it would hold meaning anymore. That day, as I left grandmother's house, I accepted my true identity. I had to build a life on my own because I now knew who I was and what I wanted to do. I stayed in this house, but I would also create my own life. In the evening, I was alone in a room that belonged to me. As I glanced at my phone, I received a message. It was from my mother, simply asking, "How do you feel?" I thought for a few seconds before replying. But this time, I didn't feel compelled to explain my emotions to anyone. "I found my path," I wrote, "and my path now leads in a different direction." That morning, as I left my old house in Philadelphia, everything felt clearer than ever before. Finding my true identity wasn't just about shedding the destructive burdens of the past, it was about recognizing myself and accepting my own worth. Now, I wanted to exist in this life solely as myself. But freedom sometimes requires moving beyond even fear itself. I'd moved into a small apartment. The old house had been like a world that didn't belong to me. Every corner held connections, people who knew me but never truly understood who I was. Was there anyone who really knew me? I'd sometimes ask myself. In that old house, everything had been shaped by others. Settling into my new apartment, everything was different. A new beginning, a new identity, but also a kind of loneliness. I wanted to live on my own, understanding only myself. Yet behind that desire lay a deep solitude. In the past, I'd grown up with my family's expectations of love and approval. But now those feelings had abandoned me. One day, while walking outside, I ran into an old friend. There was surprise in his eyes. "Mary, it's strange to see you here," he said. "Are you really coming back? What about the issues with your family? Is it that easy to let go?" I stayed silent for just a few seconds. Was letting go really easy? No, it truly wasn't. But this journey was something beyond all that. I had to find my own identity. And this wasn't a story to be told to others. It was a story that belonged only to me. "Yes," I said, taking a deep breath. "I'm really coming back." But coming back means choosing my own path. Everything I lived through with my family was a lie. I want to find myself, to build a life that's mine. In that moment, there was disappointment in my old friend's eyes, but also a flicker of understanding. I was reminded once again that everyone has to choose their own path. No one can choose someone else's road. That evening, sitting alone in a bar, the only thought running through my mind was, who am I? Who am I really? In that old bar, sipping my drink, I'd lost myself in this city I'd known for years. Yet despite that sense of being lost, I felt the freedom within me. Finding my true identity sometimes meant feeling lost in life. But there was no more losing myself now. I had to make peace with who I was. My phone rang. It was my mother. I read her message. "Mary, I still love you. I really understand you, but I'm afraid of losing you." In that moment, I was caught in an emotional whirlwind. I still had some questions about who I was, but one thing was clearer. My path was my own. I replied to my mother, but this time I truly listened to her. I had to do this. I need to find out who I really am. I'm no longer living by others' decisions. I still love my mother, but there was a time when I'd let her shape me. This was my journey. I shouldn't live according to anyone else, not others, not my family. With every step, I was growing stronger. A week later, I returned to grandmother's mansion. I looked at that house one last time. As I stepped inside, everything felt foreign. This was a place where everything had ended, where the past lingered only as a trace. The real me was no longer here. All that remained was a woman reborn. I said goodbye to grandmother Eleanor's memories. As I left family ties behind, everything began to take on greater meaning. The influence of the past had ended, and I started living with my true identity. Building a new life meant creating one where everything was truly my choice. Philadelphia's streets felt less familiar with every step. But this wasn't a feeling of alienation, it was one filled with renewal. Having found my true identity and embraced my freedom, I'd finally shed the burdens of the past and the shadow of my family. Now I was living solely for myself. That morning, as I sat in grandmother's old mansion, I decided to confront the past one last time. I needed to heal its wounds. For years, I'd seen the desire for acceptance in my father's and other family members' eyes. But now I knew what true acceptance really was: accepting yourself, making peace with who you are. Building a life of my own meant recognizing myself and moving forward on my own path in the end. In my eyes, I felt the indelible traces of the past, but also the peace of a new beginning. Looking slowly at the old walls, I realized this house, which had shaped me for years, no longer had anything to do with my identity. My phone rang. It was a message from my father. "We need to meet one more time." "How do you define me, Mary?" In that moment, how did I define him? I thought about it. For years, my father had told me who I should be. But now, answering that question, I understood who I truly was. Mary was beyond the past and everything this family thought she wasn't. Those old questions, the past, they no longer had anything to do with me. I met with my father. I knew he was expecting a response to that morning's message. This was the final confrontation with the past, but it wasn't a confrontation, it was an acceptance. In my father's eyes, I saw nothing but those cold stares. But something had changed within me. This time I was strong. "You need to accept this, Mary," he said, his voice calm but cold. "You need to recognize your true identity. We're doing this for you. Your place is here as part of this family." "No," I said, and this time there was no softness in my voice. "My place is somewhere else now. I found who I truly am. And that place isn't about being someone you want me to be. I have to move forward on my own path." My father fell silent for a moment, avoiding my gaze, and he realized something. I was no longer the person he'd tried to shape. Accepting my true identity meant choosing not to live a life that belonged to others. "Fine," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "You're choosing your own path in the end. But don't forget this. You'll always remember us, no matter what." In that moment, I embraced my true freedom. This wasn't the end of the journey. In fact, the real journey was just beginning. That day, as I closed the door to the old house, all that remained were memories. Years of expectations, the constant search for approval, everything stayed in the past. Now, I was simply a woman who decided to find her own way. The peace I felt within came after it all. Grandmother's inheritance was something that didn't belong to me. That fortune was just a tangible reminder of the past. The true inheritance was the moment I found my identity. Building my own life meant making my own decisions. I no longer needed my father's or my family's constant approval. Proving of myself was enough now. That night, I did something for myself. I wrote a piece in memory of grandmother. I wanted to say goodbye to her, but also to create something for myself. By carving my own path, I put an end to the past defining me. That writing wasn't just a farewell to grandmother. It was a symbol of the final step I'd taken to find my true self. I wrote slowly. "This life will be shaped not by others' decisions, but by my own. True freedom is finding and accepting myself." And with that, I finished the piece. My new life began right here,